Coming. Here we go. All right, little group tonight. Let's see how we go. We might get some more people jump in as we go. Numbers tend to drop towards this time of the semester. Everyone's busy trying to get assignments and things in. So this is fairly typical. Hello, Megan. How are you?
Hi, yeah, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
That's good. Good. We're just kicking off, so you haven't missed anything. Here's some people
Great.
come. Here's Renee. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
I don't know why my camera's not working again this week.
That's okay. That's
Oh,
all
hang
right.
on, maybe it is.
That's all right.
There it is.
There it is. Hello. All right. I was just starting, so good timing. Tonight I just want to. I'm not gonna talk too much on this, but lots of public commentary at the moment for our First Nations friends, particularly around Senator Lydia Thorpe. Lots of public debate. The only thing I'm going to say on the matter is I think it's just a really hard time for a lot of First Nations people with the amount of fanfare over visiting royals. And maybe it's just a nice time for us to check in with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family and friends and colleagues and just see if they're okay. So that's all I'll say on that tonight. And acknowledge that this land was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Tonight, we're looking at specific population groups and trauma. So it's a pretty heavy subject. I've got a couple of short videos for you to watch. Again, heavy. There's some personal sort of lived experience stories that are shared in those. So just, I guess, be cautious, look after yourselves tonight. People are off camera, so I'm not going to know whether people are traveling okay. If you disappear, that's okay. Please tap out if it's something that's going to be a bit sort of triggering or a bit close to home for you guys. And that's all I'll kind of say. Flick me an email afterwards if you need to have a chat tomorrow. I'm at TAFE graduation, so I can't call anyone until the afternoon, but if you need to, I'm willing to, and always happy to have a bit of a download if you need one. All right, we'll start with first frontline workers. Because it is a heavy topic, we may finish early tonight. We'll see how we go in terms of how much chatter we have. But otherwise, I'll finish you probably a little bit early, just because it is a bit heavy going. So frontline workers, I think, is a topic very well documented that first responders or frontline workers experience higher stress levels, significantly higher instances of anxiety and depression above the population norm, for a whole bunch of reasons. We know from the increase in workers' comp claims that the incidence of PTSD and related secondary trauma experiences, that this demographic experiences, that they are absolutely experiencing harm as a result of their occupations. Undebatable. Indebatable? Undebatable. Not debatable. Whichever negative connotation you want to take from that. My words have gone tonight. We know that retired firefighters have a prevalence of PTSD more than 2 times higher than current firefighters, for example, as a population. Part of this is due to the kind of in-group nature of frontline workers. If anybody has studied group work or group dynamics, well, that's a naughty dog, sorry. You'll be familiar with this phrase of in-out group, in-group, out-group, in terms of social psychology. So it talks about how groups of people identify with each other and how they form a bit of a collective identity. So frontline workers will generally report that their work is more than just a job. It's a life calling, it's a passion. They were driven to do it. It's who they are. It's very much part of an identity, which generally means that workers bond tightly with other workers. Not least because for many of them, their actual survival means that they have to trust each other and rely on each other, more so than in other careers. The benefits to this type of group bonding and group thinking are that you often experience closer bonds with your colleagues. You have a higher incidence of those trusted friends that the critical friend that you check yourself with. If you need to download with that person or debrief with that person, it tends to increase your resilience, and as such, your career longevity can sometimes be attributed to the people that you work alongside. It's often the number one point when you ask a bunch of frontline workers what sustains you in your job, they will more often than not say the people that I work with. So there is a definite positive and a definite benefit to that in-group identity, but it also means that trauma is often shared in that group because of the level of empathy and connection that we feel with each other's trauma and each other's experience. We see and hear experiences of trauma as a frontline worker at a rate far higher than the general population, and often without any recovery period in between. So not just an increased witnessing of trauma, but if you think of somebody working in defence, police, nursing, it's one after the other after the other. And often on a shift, you go from, one room to the next room to the next room with no downtime in between. So where your average person experiences trauma, even on a frequent basis, there's downtime in between to reset and regulate. Frontline workers often don't have that. We also generally work in fields that are already high pressure. The pace is fast, the workload's huge, the turnaround time's usually next to nothing. It's usually very crisis-driven work. So it's already a high pressure environment. And then you add on to that the type and the nature of work and conversations that you have. As an industry, it's already generally emotionally charged. So the work that we do generally causes very high levels of emotion, and the emotional toll of caring for people in distress can't be understated, and also leads to things like compassion fatigue, which can sit alongside that secondary traumatic stress. There's also often a lack of support, and we've spoken about this as the semester's rolled on, that organisations will often have an EAP service, and that's wonderful. But sometimes you've got to wait days and days to speak to that person. It's all very formalised. There's some anxiety around, it's a work service. How much are they going to document? There's often just a generalised lack of support. So in a role where the pace and the workload is huge, there's often not the availability of a debrief straight after an event. So you're supposed to go on pouring from a cup that's already overflowing. And that's, cumulative stress, and that's significant. So over time, those repeated exposures to trauma accumulate, right? The bucket gets fuller and fuller and fuller. And without debrief, without supervision, without rest in between, the chance to decompress and relax and think about things that are not work, that bucket never empties. So, of course, it's just going to spill over. That's common sense. And the last reason why this demographic often experiences higher rates is because there's often role conflicts. So this is where there is a need to balance our work supporting clients with what's happening for us personally. We talked a little bit about last week the cultural load that First Nations communities experience when they're expected to carry that load. That's a role conflict. And I think I mentioned Dr. Shay Brown talks a lot about how difficult it is in family and domestic violence, in communities where there's been high rates of incarceration, how difficult it is to go and work in a jail and try and create sustainable change on that side of the fence when, the trauma of seeing your mob and community, particularly in a custodial setting, is really difficult. And again, like rural and remote communities, chances are people are doing more than one role and more than one position in community, and how difficult that is to balance those. So an added load, I guess, to an already overflowing cup. And then you add on the pandemic. So I think the easiest way to put it is the COVID-19 pandemic probably disproportionately amplified people's workloads and then subsequent stress levels. You already had workers feeling tired and burnt out. Then we had, lots of evidence and research talking about increased rates of family violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, because everybody's at home, we're all under the same roof, the protective factors are not there anymore. Kids can't go to school, which is a protective factor. There's eyes on them, they're out of the home. They're suddenly exposed to a whole bunch of stuff that's happening, that they may not have necessarily been exposed to. We had people working longer hours. They had to learn new things. They had to develop and write all these new mandates and policies with 5 minutes notice. They had to oversight workers at home and find ways of still getting work and tasks done and balancing homeschooling and meeting service delivery goals to clients in an online, very foreign space. We had workers that were working out of paper files suddenly having to learn whole new software systems and import information and all of the necessary kind of stuff that went alongside with that. So obviously increased mental health, clearly increased mental health, lack of resources and support services that aren't there, that can't provide those services online, that just didn't have the capacity to do it. And we had to do all of that while also experiencing significant fear. We've spoken a lot this semester about what fear does to the body. The pandemic is I think the nicest way to capture it is that it's a stressful event, but it's unpredictable and it's extreme and it's prolonged and it's based on this like unfamiliar danger. No one had ever really dealt with anything like that before. So it's likely to activate that physiological danger response, right? And produce really intense stress. And all that stress is coursing through our nervous systems, fighting the systems that are trying to shut down in order to allow us to survive. So remember, we spoke about the parts of the brain that turn off temporarily in the face of a threat. Those parts of the brain, ironically, are the same parts that we rely on to do our jobs, right? The multitasking, the consequential thinking, the working through problem solving, like all of that stuff turns itself off in the face of a threat because you're in survival mode. But you kind of need it in a pandemic to work through, what's happening and to work through your job at the same time. So how do you manage both of that happening concurrently? How do you fight your brain's natural response to shut that stuff down? So we know women, children, youth, those with disability, aged care, they were all more likely to be subjected to maltreatment, exposure to domestic violence, the usual services that would support vulnerable families and provide those targeted services were not able to. And then if we look at kind of the concept of the financial stress and hardship that people went through, the social isolation, which was massive for people, grief and loss and all of that hardship that people are carrying. And then, look at our demographic of children and young people that were already experiencing adverse childhood experiences. Maybe they were in out-of-home care, maybe they were in refuges. That lack of predictability paired with a lack of control exacerbates the stress response. And it's compounded for people that are already survivors of early childhood trauma. Have all those anxiety responses triggered by the social climate. And for children and young people, we really saw those anxiety responses very heightened, reactivated. The brain and the body have already lived through all these worst case scenarios in their history. So they kind of know what that feels like and they're really determined not to go back there again. And so that fight, flight, freeze we saw go into overdrive. So yeah, we saw that as a population, I think, really clearly. That, like living with a fire alarm that keeps going off at random intervals 24 hours a day, very hard for the rational brain to be convinced that that won't happen because it knows that has happened in the past, right? It's trained itself for survival. So a very complex overlaying layer that happened with the pandemic, and certainly still being experienced today. It might not necessarily be the same way. We might not be glued to the news every morning watching Gladys and her updates, but the trauma hasn't gone away for lots of people in terms of that. So still very relevant. There's a little ABC clip I'm going to show you now. These go for a couple of minutes. They're not long. There's two of them, one now and one when we get to veteran mental health. So I'll pop this on. I'm going to just mute myself and we'll come back in a couple of minutes and maybe just think about any reflections we took out of it. Everyone finished? Yeah. Takeaways?
I have an experience because I had 3 times operation in almost 1 year, and I've been in hospital. I noticed that the way the nurses have been treated, it was awful, and they were under enormous stress. When I saw them, I remember I was in the queue for early morning operation, and there was a lot of people standing in the queue, and the nurse was very frustrated. She was exhausted. It was 6 a.m. And then the other nurse, which I believe she was a supervisor, she came and asked her, to do the work faster. And she was so close to just like scream, I would say.
Yeah.
And then left. And I remember the time I needed help because I did the knee operation, and because the nurse were under so much stress and keep the other nurse asked her, to go here and there. She had to leave me in between, where I needed her, to go and attend someone else because she had to report. And yeah, I noticed the culture of bullying in hospitals here is extreme.
Yeah, it's a fairly toxic environment from everyone that I've ever spoken to who works in health, unfortunately. I don't think I've heard too many good experiences in health, which is sad. And you're right, they're just exhausted. They're at that point where you turn up to work, you got 10% left, and that drains pretty quickly. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Any other takeaways? Doug?
What I've found both in frontline and defence forces, we have a way of eating our own, eating the young as such.
Yeah.
That's a big cause of mental health stress within the department. I noticed that, we do eat our young a lot.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of trying to get rid of the change of culture as such. Is a big issue to try, because at the moment we've got a lot on workers' comp throughout the department.
Yep.
And now the department's actually, in with workplace safety and our QBE insurance to try and figure out how we can actually try and reduce this workers' comp load as such off the books.
Yeah. Yep. It's pretty intense. Megan?
I think that the culture is changing from a paramedic point of view. I think the years of the pandemic were the hardest years that the paramedics have faced, especially in the metropolitan area. Also, I think that just when I've been a paramedic for almost 20 years, and when I joined the job, we never showed that you were upset. It was something that you didn't do. You just got on with the next job. And if you couldn't handle it, then maybe you shouldn't be a paramedic. That was the sort of culture. Whereas now the culture has changed. There are avenues if you need help. And I think more people are willing to say now that they are struggling.
Yeah, it's nice to hear about that change. It's one of those things that doesn't move as fast as you want it to, but it's big government, clunky system, right? They're never going to go as fast as you want it to. I think the police are moving in the right direction too, from what I've heard. Obviously, still hear a lot of feedback when we run training and things with police about their experiences, but not only are there psychology appointments that are kind of just booked and put on you. It's okay, it's psych day today, we're all going, to have your meeting. But I think it's becoming a little bit more acceptable to turn up and kind of say, not traveling that great. I think unfortunately it's probably one of those things that depends on the station and depends on the supervisor and all of that kind of stuff. But it's nice to see incremental change. Roshini, a lot of you bad experience in any frontline? Yeah, 100%. I feel for you guys with the NDIS too. It was a typical government system, and that it was rolled out before it was ready, and you're navigating this massive clunky. I don't think any government service is actually very user friendly, and that's where it falls down more often than not. So you get people that are frustrated trying to navigate services, trying to obtain funding, trying to get the right person to speak to. TAFE's no different. You guys experience all sorts of drama trying to get through to counsellors and disability consultants. I get emails all the time. So I don't know the wand fix for it, but it is a government thing wholeheartedly, I think.
I think my comment to that is I've been working in disabilities for 15 years, and I started before the NDIS.
Yeah.
And a lot of funding was delivered in pockets, and people that were mainly of low socioeconomic families didn't get much access. And so I suppose I've seen the benefit.
Yeah.
But I do see it on the news, and I have people come and complain to me about how it's a rip-off and a rort,
Yep.
and blah, blah, blah. And I just explain it like this. We've got tax agents that, there's people that audit, not tax agents, there's people that audit you for tax purposes, and they'll find out if you're doing the wrong thing. And I personally believe that we need it for NDIS as well. I used to work for myself a few years ago, and it's so easy to put in invoices for things you don't do. And but I see the good. I see the benefit.
I have heard that. I've heard a lot of feedback about how services are suddenly triple the price for the same thing just because it's under the NDIS. And look, I'm like you. I choose to think that eventually evil finds the light of day. And just like we're seeing now, all those people that got fined recently for rorting the COVID things, I think in 4 or 5 years' time, we'll see some type of oversight body developed that will rip shreds through that industry, and people will be in big trouble.
When we go into the hospitals to support, we do a transition. People coming out of hospital when they've had strokes or other massive health issues, and they've been in hospital for a large amount of time, and we're transitioning them into a SIL or whatever it is. And that when we come in, the nurses are so relieved because we're there to sit and talk and get to know the participant. And she's like, oh my God, it's so good. I can actually go to the toilet now. Because half the time we get there in the afternoon and they haven't had a toilet break. So,
basic human rights, hey? Like the very basic human rights. How to avoid a UTI is just to regularly be able to use a bathroom. It's awful. Yeah, okay. So this next part is about military veterans. I'm going to talk a little bit about this slide, and then we have a sensitive content warning. The last 2 slides speak about the Royal Commission, very heavy suicide-loaded topic, so feel free to tap out if you need to there. Look, as a demographic, I think it wasn't really until 2000 when psychologists, particularly in our country, began flagging with member associations the increased amounts of PTSD they were seeing. Substance abuse, anxiety disorders, they were all rapidly rising. Most of the PTSD programs that existed before 2000 were developed based on Vietnam. So fairly outdated programs. Wonderful, in themselves, and they served a purpose, but quite outdated and not specific to, I think, the current Australian demographic. And then we had a series of younger veterans deployed in places like East Timor or Afghanistan or Iraq that were then coming through with very serious worries about their quality of life, and concerned that these were younger males, which were a demographic in themselves as being less likely to reach out for help or for treatment. So post-2000, there was a host of programs developed. I know there was a big one, perhaps over in Western Australia, called the Hollywood Clinic, that was like an 18-week outpatient program. It was kind of pioneered in Australia. But I think the issue that we had was that this was a demographic that already had lots of pre-existing issues like bullying and harassment, very high rates of suicide, very poor mental health and sexual assault already existing in that space. And as once described to me, it's a world not very well understood by anyone who doesn't live in it. Right? It's quite secretive. It's closed off unless you have a family member who's in the ADF, or someone, or your partner. It's not something very well understood or very openly spoken about. So you have these extra factors that exist in a very unique environment. So I've heard it referred to as moral wounding. So not so much the engagement with the enemy, but being exposed to the way that human beings treat each other. And I've also heard it kind of described as this cultural shock. So visiting or serving in countries where women might not be as respected, where children might not be as regarded as important, or where hard work's not valued, or, you know, watching 7 and 8 year olds, you know, work 15, 16-hour days on a farm instead of going to school. That stuff can be a bit of a culture shock already, and a bit of a wound to people's values and people's morals. And we know that PTSD is often experienced when someone's value system is tested. So, you know, I think I read about an example of a soldier who had been trained to neutralize the enemy with the words, and avoid contact with locals unless absolutely necessary. But a child kept coming up begging for money and begging for food and begging for help. And that particular soldier had real difficulty ignoring that child to focus on their job when they kind of had kids back home similar age. And just one example of probably a billion that really sat particularly difficult with that soldier. So we know from all the research that's happened post 2000 that our veterans in this country experience much higher rates of PTSD. They've often experienced intense combat, beyond the realms of anything any of us can probably imagine. The transition from military to civilian life is really hard, not just in terms of the pace, but the loudness of where they've come from and the quietness back home. I've heard it, you know, described feelings of isolation, having difficulty adjusting to a non-combat role. And, you know, think about the stuff that we've already spoken about in terms of your neural pathways and your nervous system, and how much that's already been on hyper arousal and hyper alert for so long in survival mode. You can't just get on a plane and switch that off. So the body has a really hard time purging all of that adrenaline, and it takes time. You know, and I think Doug kind of tapped into this, the culture and the cultural factors. I think particularly military culture often puts a lot of emphasis on stoicism, which makes it really hard for people to seek help or discuss when there's something wrong. You know, there's this kind of culture of push through and deal with it. There's pre-existing conditions. So some vets, you know, might enter the military with pre-existing mental health that can be exacerbated by combat kind of experience. There's very limited access to care sometimes, or they have to, you know, wait for a long time to get service in the community. And then there's that stigma that surrounds mental health issues in general. So here is my little sensitive content warning. There's some fairly sobering statistics in relation to suicide and heavy suicide discussion beyond this point. So take care of yourselves in the next little bit. I wanted to highlight the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide because it's just been released, the final report. For anybody who has a particular interest in this stuff, there are some shortened versions of the report. They've broken it down in terms of theme. So there's about 6, I think, of them. They're about 6 or 7 pages long, so they're readable, I suppose, in an hour. Heavy reading, but very interesting reading. The Royal Commission was undertaken by a gentleman called Nick Caldas, who was the old Deputy Commissioner of Police. So a very smart, switched-on man who'd been very heavily entrenched in this style of hierarchy before. And he came up with 122 recommendations, so a fairly solid review. It went for 3 years, and it was based on the 1,677 confirmed suicides they had, but it is noted in the report that the actual number of preventable deaths they estimated at over 3,000. So what they found, I'm going to read some excerpts of the report now. Male members serving in the permanent forces are 30% more likely to die by suicide than employed Australian males. Male permanent members serving in a combat or security role are 100% more likely to die by suicide than employed Australian males. Males, ex-serving members who served in permanent forces, 42% more likely to die by suicide than Australian males. Males, ex-serving members who served in combat or security roles in the army are 112 times more likely to die by suicide than Australian males. Female, permanent or reserves, ex-serving members are 107% more likely to die by suicide than Australian females, and female ex-serving members who served in combat or security roles are 452% more likely to die by suicide than Australian females. So I don't know that sobering is the word. I can't think of a word that's more appropriate to use though. But this is why we had a very urgent Royal Commission push through. So it ran for more than 3 years. And the final report, like I said, is quite damning, but very interesting to read in terms of cultural shift and cultural growth that's required. It came up with a bunch of themes in terms of where the most submissions were received. So the first was in relation to recruitment and retainment of staff. Like any frontline service, I suppose, low levels of recruitment and high separation rates meant that there weren't sufficient staff. That was across Navy, Army and Air Force. And they referred to it as a hollowing out of the ADF workforce. So obviously, when there are not enough staff and the other people are picking up the load, your burnout and fatigue goes up. It also puts people at greater risk of injury. So your hyper arousal is double-fold because your life is on the line. They also found that over the past decade, the proportion of permanent members who were discharged involuntarily for medical reasons had increased from 38% to 67%. So lots of medical discharge happening there. We also know that ex-serving members who were discharged involuntarily for medical or another reason were at higher risk of suicide and suicidality as well. So that involuntary nature of being discharged caused a fracture of identity for a lot of people that just didn't know where they fit anymore, weren't sure where to put their skills and their expertise, and not well supported either. Then you have things like very deeply held cultural norms that were related to service and sacrifice. Think of, the words that we associate with Anzac Day, sacrifice. That can also be a double-edged sword because it can prevent people from seeking help for issues, particularly before they reach a crisis point. And so the report kind of goes on to describe how from the initial training onwards, members learn to put the needs of others above their own. So they're trained to push through the pain. Seeking treatment for a minor injury is often seen as a form of weakness. You're letting down the team, just push through it. This real kind of culture of the team comes first, which often really minimises the needs of an individual. It also raises a whole volume on the issue of sexual violence in the ADF. And it states that, well, the sentence is men and women serving in the ADF have signed up knowing they might be required to make the ultimate sacrifice for their country. However, for many members, the greatest source of danger comes from within the ADF itself. That's pretty damning as a sentence, particularly an organisation where your job literally is to put your life on the line. The research into people's experience, serving members' experience, said the majority of sexual violence is perpetrated by men. The majority of victims are women. While men were also victims, that those gendered patterns couldn't be ignored, particularly when ex-serving women are dying by suicide at twice the rate of the general population of females. It did highlight that beyond just the trauma that results from the actual act of sexual violence, it was the institutional response of the ADF, or lack thereof, that exacerbated people's pain and suffering. So when we talk, I think I've mentioned what's his name? Shelley Bonner and Alan Wade, that talk about systemic oppression and systems abuse, and how systems re-oppress and re-traumatize victims of domestic and family and sexual violence. These are the systems, right? The ADF. People were scared to report it because they felt that their career was going to be on the line, that they'd be ostracized, that there'd be insufficient consequences for the perpetrator, that managers and commanders hadn't undertaken trauma-informed training about how to respond. So, you know, when they did disclose, it was met with minimization, outright denial. They also highlighted that members convicted of sexual offences in the military justice system often remain in service, which is unlike a lot of other organisations around the country. You know, I find it hard to believe that would happen with a sexual offence conviction in most other organisations. And that the ADF at the time of the report didn't know how many serving members had been convicted of sexual offences in civilian courts. So even if the offence was perpetrated against another serving member, when members are convicted, they weren't transferred to civilian criminal records. So that's fairly scary, to think that all of that culture of sexual violence and sexual assaults happening in an organisation like the ADF, and people are then discharged into community, and that doesn't make its way onto a criminal record. That's really hard, right? It also completely undermines a victim talking up and saying, this is the person who harmed me. Well, where's the evidence? It's really tough. Yeah, I think, look, I'll capture the report at that. It is well worth a read. It's a very important read. It's like the institutionalized responses to, you know, children and young people in care and sexual assault and things. They're not easy reads, but they're important ones. And the population that you guys are out there working with and working alongside and sometimes have belonged to, we need to know this stuff. We need to be aware of it. So I'm going to show you this little video. This one has a very brave man talking about his experience of PTSD. So feel free to not watch it if you think that's going to upset you. That's it for content tonight. So we'll watch that little video, and then I think we'll come back and just have a little debrief about something that's not trauma related, just to kind of reset people and send you off not thinking about all of this fresh in mind. So I might mute myself while we watch this one, and we'll come back. Yeah. Any takeaways? That it's okay if people don't want to discuss, we can park it there. Just thought I'd open it.
It's very true in the fact that there is a lot more resources inside than outside for assistance, I'm guessing because of the population density. But Veterans Affairs do have a substantial increase in their budget now to deal with those who actually have traumatic stress after being discharged. And about the criminal records, it was actually interesting when I left the job to come to Corrective Services, seeing that there was a lot of ex-DOD coming through the system, and having that, looking at their files and how clean it actually was. It was, It wasn't until down the track that I realised that and it's hard to get actually access to those records as well.
Yep. And I guess you can understand how bad behavior is then very much facilitated, knowing that, oh, well, shit hits the fan and I go out, no one's going to know. It's really disturbing. Okay, if no one has any more takeaways, let's do this for a minute. I just want to reset, calm the mind. I'm going to throw it out. I will watch the chat for people that can't talk because of small humans and things in the background. Tell me something you read, watched, listened to recently that you enjoyed, something that made you laugh, or something that's on your agenda to watch or read or listen to in the next week. That's not this related. Don't write and say the Royal Commission reports, please. Something that's not related. Anything anyone's watching good?
I just finished reading a book today when I was trying to not work on my essay that's due at the end of next week. And it's sort of related, but not. It's the sequel to It Ends With Us. And
Colleen Hoover.
Yeah, and I didn't like the movie. I like the book much better, but that's always my issue.
Yeah.
The next book in the series is called It Starts With Us, and it's actually quite beautiful. So.
Oh, nice.
It's not, well, there's DV in it, of course, but it's about a guy that realizes he's got a 12-year-old brother that he didn't know he had, and he removes him from their parent, and it starts with us, their family tree. So it's actually quite beautiful.
Oh, that's nice.
That was lovely.
Yeah, she's got quite the cult following, Colleen Hoover.
I just bought some books off Marketplace and it was in it. I didn't realise. And then the next minute there's a movie. So
yeah, nice. Oh, good one. Anyone else reading anything? I love reading. I will devour books in the holiday break.
I signed up with Audible, so audiobook. I found it recently. Somebody recommended, and I love it. I can listen to the book while I'm driving or cooking, so I don't have to carry the book here and there. The only issue I have, I need to learn how to summarize it, or because I can't go back and see where, when I hear something interesting while I'm driving, I don't know, like, how can I go back when I reach home and find it? So that's the only problem I have with it. Otherwise, I really like it. I recommend it.
Yeah, I quite like Audible too. I listened to Matthew McConaughey's book on Audible, and he sounds just as good reading his book, can I say, for fans of Matthew McConaughey. And I know I said no trauma, but Britney Spears' book is actually very nicely narrated by Michelle Williams, which is worth listening to. Rashini, that's actually really funny. I shouldn't laugh, but that's very funny.
I laughed.
Yep. Oh, good one. I'll never forget. I know this is silly, but for followers of Missy Higgins, she posted a video a number of years back of her daughter Luna, who had discovered the F-bomb. And she was filming from a hallway, so the little girl couldn't hear her, and it was wonderful. clearly had listened to mummy or daddy dropping the F-bomb more than a few times and picked it up herself, but the way it was delivered was bang on. So well worth watching if you're an Instagram person. It's on there somewhere. Anyone else watching or reading anything? I'm watching at the moment series 2 of Your Honor on Stan, which is a very good series. It's got the fellow from Breaking Bad in it, whose name I always forget, the older fellow. And it's a story of, he is a Supreme Court, it's in the American system. He's a judge, and his son accidentally runs over and kills the son of like the local crime boss, the mafia boss. And all the steps he takes then to cover it up because he's terrified his son's going to get killed by a hit if they find out. So it's very good. It's well worth watching. Anyone else listening to anything good? Reading, watching?
I'm 3/4 of the way through The Body Keeps the Score. It's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, it's a good book, isn't it?
Because I've got it on Audible now, so I'm getting through it quicker than reading it.
Yeah, I do that too sometimes. If there's a big book that I know I just don't have the manpower to do, I'll listen to it on Audible in the car, and that way I can hear it while I'm driving.
Yeah, so I've got 3 chapters left of that book.
Yeah, nice. Nice. Really, everyone. Anyone else want to share anything?
Yeah, I will. That's Megan. I just finished a audiobook as well, I Fight, You Fight by Alex Noble. It's an absolutely excellent book if you haven't read it. Alex is
I'm gonna write that down.
It's a young man who when he was 17 or 18, he had he sustained a traumatic injury. He broke his neck, and he's now a quadriplegic. And his story, and I really recommend the audiobook because there's a chapter by his mum that she actually reads. I think Kylie Gillies does the forward, but and then you hear his dad speak and his brother speak, and it's just it just really touched me. It's a really good book.
Wow. Am I going to cry? Is it one that I can't listen to when I'm walking because I'll be sobbing and people will be wondering what's wrong with me?
Yes. Probably don't listen to it in the car.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
But yeah, it's a great book.
Nice. All right. I might leave it at that. I won't push people to offer anything else, but I will just say it's a really heavy topic this week. So please don't feel shy to sing out if you want to have a chat afterwards or tomorrow. I'll be back from graduation kind of after lunch. So I'm around, and I'm around all day Friday. I'm happy to call you. Okay. That's it. Fare thee well. Week 11, 1 week left. Holy moly. And a reminder about assignments. Thank you for saying that. It's due week 13, I think. Yep. So you've got 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks. So I'll have a Q&A next week for last minute questions on the assignment. So bring all of those. Take care of yourselves and each other and have a lovely week ahead. And I'll see you all for the last time until the electives next week. Thanks, everyone.
Night, Carly.
Good night. Is everything? I'm going to turn off the recording. Sarah's in the background. Stop.